Thank you very much. I am truly honored to receive this year's Global Economy Prize in Economics. Als jemand, der etwa 3 Stunden südlich von hier in Braunschweig geboren ist, bedeutet mir diese Ehrung umso mehr. I would like to thank the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, one of the most special research institutes in the world, with its more than a century-old history, research tradition, and contributions to the field of economics. Nobel laureate Chicago economist Robert Lucas Jr. once said, "Once you start to think about economic growth, it is hard to think about anything else." So these words by Professor Lucas summarize why so many scholars, including myself, found it really hard to think about anything else and spent our careers trying to understand the process of economic growth. The world economy has been going through some drastic changes in recent decades. While some economies have benefited from this, many economies suffered from low growth, rising inequality, and decline in business dynamism and social mobility. In my research, I investigate why this is the case and argue that one cannot prescribe a common solution to all economic problems in every country. Countries are like fingerprints, and every country is unique in its own way. And therefore, I highlight the importance of microdata-driven approach for country and region-specific diagnosis and policy recommendations. This can only be achieved through a detailed examination of related firms, individuals like entrepreneurs, scientists, workers, and institutions. So I would like to give you 3 examples. Of course, I've done work in many different countries, but just to highlight the importance of the uniqueness and the importance of the data, I would like to give you 3 examples. Let's start from the US. When we look at the data, the US economy is suffering from declining competition in recent decades. So the market leaders' market share is increasing, and in contrast, the labor share, the fraction of GDP that's being paid to workers as income, is declining from 70% down to 60% in over 30 years. So this is extremely important because if we want to generate inclusive growth, if we care about inequality, it is important where the income is being spent and the income is going. Relatedly, when the market leaders are so gigantically big, the entry is declining. So for instance, when you look at the rate of entrepreneurship in the US, it used to be around 15% around 1980s. Now it's down to 6%. Because when students are graduating from schools, instead of trying to form their own companies and trying to compete with the market leaders, they try to look for good paying jobs in those companies because they do not want to compete just because, as also Professor Cote mentioned, it's very difficult to compete with these market leaders which have huge arsenal of patents and intellectual property. And as a result, we have to, when we think about industrial policy, we have to take it into account that the fact that we have this gigantic market concentration is also a result of the industrial policies that were implemented in the past. All those policies from the past were being utilized mostly by these big incumbent companies who have an army of lawyers who can benefit from this. So as a result, small entrepreneurs were not benefiting from this. And as a result, we end up in this really massive market concentration, which is a big threat for dynamism and competition. Relatedly, in recent work, we look at the hiring behavior of firms, especially market leaders. And of course, one of the most important resources for innovation is human capital and engineers and inventors. The question is, what happens to an inventor or an engineer if that person moves from a small company to a large market incumbent? Does that person become more productive because now I move to a big company like Microsoft, Apple, and now I have a lot of resources so I can become more innovative? Or is there something else? Without looking at the data, you cannot answer this question. So that's why we looked at the census records of all the firms and tried to see what happens when a worker is changing a job. What we see is quite striking. So you look at an inventor, and that inventor moves, for instance, in 1 year from a small company to a large company. From that point on, the salary jumps dramatically. Well, you might say this is expected because this person is going to become more productive now. The answer is no. When the person changes the jobs, the salary goes up, but the productivity goes down dramatically. The innovativeness of the person goes down dramatically. So now we have to ask ourselves, of course, it's important to think about all these R&D spending, R&D numbers, but those R&D numbers, at the end of the day, there are individuals behind those. And we have to ask ourselves how we utilize these limited talent pool in a society, right? So that's why I think when it comes to the US, the main problem there is the super increased market concentration and declined competition. Now I want to switch gear and talk a little bit about another study that we've conducted recently in Italy. So, of course, when you think about competition or innovation, we like to have creative destruction, where unproductive firms, unproductive incumbents are eliminated by more productive, more innovative new entrant. And that way, fresh blood will come into the economy and there will be turnover. But then incumbents have every incentive to resist the change. So can we somehow see this in the data and potentially think about what to do? Of course, this is a very challenging task. So how can we really study potentially strategic behavior of the firms? In the case of Italy, we did something very interesting. We took the registry of local politicians in Italy, and we tried to analyze the political connections of the firms. Indeed, Professor Koht also mentioned that, lobbyists can be active whenever there is some government willingness to intervene. There will be always room for lobbyists and strategic behavior. So in the case of Italy, we took the registry of local politicians of more than 500,000 local politicians, mayor, vice mayors, vice presidents, etc. And then we merged it with the registry of, with the social security records of Italians, more than 50 million Italians. So looking at the microdata is really striking in that sense to really understand what's going on. And what we saw was very interesting. We looked at the largest 20 firms in every market, and we asked to the data, what happens as the firm is becoming the dominant market leader? Are they innovating more, or are they doing something else? And what we saw was, as the firm is becoming the dominant market leader, what it does is it becomes more politician intensive. The number of politicians relative to firm size goes up dramatically, but the number of patents, number of innovation it produces goes down significantly. So this is what we call the leadership paradox. So again, it goes back to the same issue. So there's a political economy problem that we always have to keep in mind. When we provide subsidies, of course, these are all well-intended policy interventions, but at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, what happens to the taxpayers' money if it's being utilized mostly by market leaders versus small, young entrepreneurs? So that's why it's really essential to, instead of just treating all the firms are the same, no, every firm has a different incentive in the market, and we can only understand this by studying the data in detail. Let me now switch to India, for instance, some poor countries, some developing countries. So in poor countries, the problem is completely different. But the big mistake in poor countries is trying to adopt the same policies directly from the Western world and trying to implement the same thing and expect to have the same result. It cannot happen, because every country, as I said in the very beginning of my talk, has their own problems, and it has to be studied in its own way, right? So, for instance, Mr. Ahlmann might have a headache, and he might have used a medication which worked for him, and I cannot go to the doctor and say, hey, I have a headache, please give me the same medication. The same symptom can be caused by many different reasons. So low productivity growth can be a reason for different reasons in different countries. So in India, we studied the firms, and when you look at the data, of course, Indian firms, they are all super small, super micro, and they don't invest, they don't grow. And the typical idea is that, well, they lack money and finance. So let's give more microcredit, and let's try to give them more finance. Clearly, we've been doing that for many, many years. It's not working, because there are other problems when it comes to India. So the previous literature has shown that normally, what should predict a firm size? A firm size should be very correlated with the success of the business, right? What is the success of the business? It's the quality of the product that I'm selling. It's the quality of the technology that I'm using. But when you look at Indian firms, one of the best predictor of firm size is not the quality of the good. It's the size of the family of the business owner. Or to be more precise, it's the number of male children that the business owner has. Clearly, there are some other problems in that economy. So, and the main problem there is the lack of trust. Okay, lack of trust on the system, on the political system, on the judicial system, on the police force. And that's why the Indian entrepreneurs are not willing to do business with non-family members. Because if they hire somebody from outside the family, if the person steals, you cannot really chase that person and get your belongings from that person. So as a result, if you go to poor countries, instead of providing R&D subsidy, there's pecking order of problems. Fixing the institutions, fixing the environment, fixing the institutional environment is the first order problem. Then finance, then other things will come along, right? So that's why it is really essential to think region or country-specific, region-based policies instead of coming up with an umbrella policy prescriptions. And we've recently started to do a very detailed project studying German reunification. Indeed, it's also very interesting when you look at East and West Germany. So, of course, in the beginning, the income per capita gap between East and West in the early 90s was about 40%. Now it's 80%. Still, it hasn't been closed. So there's still a gap between East and West in terms of income per capita. So what is the problem? What is the reason there? So the same methodology, we try to carry it here. And so we are digitizing the archives of Treuhands and all these privatized firms from early 90s. We are studying them in detail. But you can already see, for instance, if you create the heat map of cities in terms of income per capita, in terms of social mobility, in terms of inequality, in terms of innovation per person, or in terms of the share of foreigners among high-skilled, you can still identify this invisible border between East and West Germany extremely visibly, extremely visibly. So now we have to ask ourselves, what are the underlying causes and how can this be fixed? And of course, there are many, many reasons behind, and so we are in the midst of working on those topics. But you can already see that, for instance, in early 90s, there was too much focus on preserving employment, but not so much attention on technology and innovation and how to bolster innovation. Because innovation and technology is something that's not going to pay off immediately. It's going to pay off in a couple of years, and you need to be patient for that. And as policymakers, you need to be patient and not have a short-sighted plan ahead of you. And that's why, of course, it gets more challenging when it comes to thinking about long-term growth and long-term innovation. So the final thing I would like to mention on this issue is that when it comes to policymaking, there's a lot of focus on firms, rightly so, but firms are not some abstract entities. There are individuals inside those firms. Right? And we need to ask ourselves, are we utilizing the right talents in the right positions? Because financial resources, you can fix financial resources. If there's financial misallocation today, with the right policies, in a couple of years, you can fix it. But if there's misallocation of human capital, if there's misallocation of talent, or if we educate the wrong talents in schools, we can never win that generation back. Those generations are lost permanently, right? So that's why, for instance, we are doing some very detailed investigation on this topic too, and we ask ourselves, who are the inventors? What are their socioeconomic backgrounds? And what we see is very striking. When you look at the parental income, rich families are much more likely to have innovative kids. So the relationship between parental income and child's likelihood of being an inventor is extremely tight, especially among the top 5% of the income distribution of parents. So if we end up just educating rich families' kids, and then they form businesses, they innovate, and they earn money, then we will never fix income inequality, and we will never generate social mobility. Right? So to make the growth more inclusive, we have to also ask ourselves how we are utilizing the limited talent pool in a country. So that's why, while we are focusing through our policies quite a bit on firms and subsidizing, taxing, etc., we need to also think about our education policy and also high-skill immigration policy too. Because, you know, high-skill immigrants can also create substantial spillovers, the way, for instance, we saw in the early 20th century of the US. And when it comes to the US, for instance, we know that in the long run, economic growth is driven by innovation. But how do you study innovation in the long run? There's no data on this, right, over 100 years. And in order to really do some data-driven exercise, what we had done was we went to the archives of US Patent Office and we digitized their patent records since 1836. That way, over 200 years, you could study, for instance, Thomas Edison, Nikola Tesla, etc., and their background, where they came from, what education they got, etc. So that's why I think, you know, the bottom line here is that it is really important, when it comes to policymaking, it is really important to look at the data for each country, for each region separately, and try to come up with their own policy recommendations. So at the end of my speech, obviously, I would like to thank my amazing co-authors and students. In my career, I've been blessed to work with brilliant people, and none of these would have been possible without their efforts, hard work, and support. And thank you, Kiel Institute, once again for this tremendous prize, which I take on behalf of my team. And finally, I would like to make a call for young researchers who are potentially watching us to come and think harder about economic growth-related issues. The field of economic growth has so many interesting open questions that will surely, once they start, have a hard time thinking about anything else. Thank you.